The auto war no one saw coming, how Canada's move shook the industry. Imagine this, car prices skyrocketing, factories shutting down overnight, and supply chains crumbling under pressure. Families who once dreamed of buying a new car, now find it completely out of reach. This isn't a distant prediction, it's happening right now. What if I told you that the crisis gripping the auto industry isn't just a result of economic fluctuations, but an all-out trade war? A battle between two of the closest allies in the world, turning once thriving industries into collateral damage. Canada has just fired back at the U.S. and the consequences are spiraling out of control. While Tesla, Ford and GM scramble to adapt, the real shocker is that Canada still holds one final move, one that could escalate this into a full-blown economic war. Stick around because what's coming next changes everything. How did we get here? The fragile web of North American manufacturing. For decades, the North American auto industry thrived on a carefully balanced ecosystem. Under agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and its successor, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, car manufacturing was a seamless operation across borders. Factories in Detroit depended on steel from Ontario. Assembly lines in Tennessee relied on precision-engineered components from Quebec. Even Tesla's ambitious expansion in electric vehicle production was fueled by essential materials imported from Canada. This deep interdependence kept production costs low, supported millions of jobs, and allowed American automakers to compete with global giants from Japan and Germany. But that system, it's now in chaos. The trigger? A seismic shift in U.S. trade policy. The tariffs that sparked a crisis. Seemingly out of nowhere, the U.S. government imposed a crippling 25% tariff on Canadian auto parts, steel, and aluminum. The White House justified the move by citing national security concerns, claiming that excessive reliance on foreign imports, even from allies, posed a risk to American manufacturing. Some policymakers insisted the tariffs were necessary to bring jobs back to the U.S., hoping to pressure companies to relocate production. But here's where things went wrong. Auto manufacturers, suppliers, and economists immediately sounded the alarm. Instead of revitalizing American manufacturing, these tariffs would do the exact opposite. Increase production costs for U.S. automakers, force layoffs across supply chains, make new cars unaffordable for millions of Americans. The auto industry operates on razor-thin profit margins. Even a small increase in material costs can set off a chain reaction of price hikes and job losses. And yet, despite these warnings, Washington refused to budge. But what they did not expect was how aggressively Canada would strike back. Canada's counterattack, a strategic masterstroke. Historically, Canada has been known for its diplomatic and measured approach to trade disputes. Negotiation was always the preferred route, but this time, not anymore. Faced with a direct assault on its manufacturing sector, Canada responded with an unexpected and devastating counterstrike. Ottawa imposed its own set of tariffs, targeting U.S. auto parts, agricultural products, and critical raw materials. These weren't random penalties, they were surgical strikes. The Canadian government strategically targeted industries and states that relied heavily on trade with Canada. The goal? To hit Washington where it hurt the most. By imposing a 25% tariff on American auto parts, Canada struck at the heart of an industry that employs over 1 million Americans. And that was just the beginning. Agricultural products were also hit, a move designed to pressure rural states that had supported the White House's tough trade stance. Duties on key raw materials like chemicals and plastics sent shockwaves through multiple U.S. industries. The result? Panic. American automakers, already grappling with supply chain disruptions, were now drowning in rising costs from both sides of the border. The impact was immediate. Car prices soared. Manufacturers faced impossible choices, either absorb the costs and bleed money, or pass them on to consumers and drive down demand. Some suppliers couldn't take the hit and collapsed entirely, shutting down factories, slashing jobs, and worsening the crisis. And while automakers struggled, another group was about to face the hardest blow: American workers. The auto industry's collapse, a domino effect. No industry felt the impact of this trade war more than automotive manufacturing. For decades, the North American auto industry operated like a well-oiled machine, with parts and materials crisscrossing borders multiple times before a finished vehicle rolled off the assembly line. But the tariffs threw a wrench into this system, forcing manufacturers to rethink their entire supply chain overnight. American automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis depended heavily on Canadian raw materials, including steel, aluminum, and advanced electronic components. Before the tariffs, These materials flowed freely, keeping production efficient and cost-effective. But with an extra 25% price tag attached to these crucial materials, factories across the U.S. were suddenly hemorrhaging money. The results? Immediate and catastrophic. Production costs surged, forcing automakers to either cut corners or jack up prices. Some companies slowed production, hoping for a resolution, but time was against them. Others scrambled to find alternative suppliers, but shifting a supply chain takes years and costs billions. And it wasn't just the big manufacturers that were feeling the heat. Auto parts suppliers, which provide everything from engine components to braking systems, were hit even harder. Unlike industry giants, many smaller suppliers operate on razor-thin profit margins. For them, even a slight increase in production costs could mean financial ruin. And that's exactly what happened. Small and medium-sized suppliers shut down completely, unable to absorb the blow. This triggered a ripple effect. Factories stopped receiving essential parts, causing delays, shortages, and even more layoffs. In a matter of months, entire communities that relied on auto industry jobs were staring down the barrel of an economic disaster. But for American workers, things were about to get even worse. The workers left behind, a crisis on Main Street. When the first wave of layoffs hit, many believed it was temporary. But as months dragged on with no resolution in sight, the reality sank in. These jobs weren't coming back. Thousands of auto workers across the U.S. found themselves out of a job or working reduced hours, struggling to make ends meet. In cities like Detroit, Michigan, and Lordstown, Ohio, where auto manufacturing is the backbone of the economy, the effects were devastating. Restaurants and local businesses saw fewer customers, grocery stores and retail shops faced declining sales, entire neighborhoods felt the economic strain as families cut spending to survive, and it wasn't just factory workers. The domino effect spread to related industries including trucking, warehousing, and retail. When an auto plant cuts production, it doesn't just affect assembly line workers, it disrupts the entire supply chain. Truck drivers transporting raw materials suddenly had fewer deliveries to make. Warehouses storing auto parts sat half empty. Even car dealerships, once bustling with customers, struggled to move inventory as vehicle prices soared beyond affordability. With fewer people able to afford new cars, the demand for used vehicles skyrocketed, sending prices into the stratosphere. For many middle-class families, buying any vehicle became an impossible task. And it wasn't just cars. The ripple effects of this trade war reached into every aspect of American life. Everything from household appliances to construction materials became more expensive, squeezing working-class families who were already struggling with rising costs. But while the American public bore the brunt of these economic hardships, something even bigger was happening behind the scenes, a political storm brewing in Washington. Political chaos, the White House under fire. As the auto industry crumbled, the political fallout became impossible to ignore. Lawmakers from key swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania sounded the alarm. With thousands of jobs on the line, both parties found themselves under immense pressure. Union leaders warned of widespread factory closures, factory workers feared losing their livelihoods, and everyday Americans demanded answers. Yet rather than backing down, the White House doubled down. Officials insisted that the tariffs were a necessary tool to bring back American manufacturing. They argued that, in the long run, these policies would strengthen the economy, even as immediate disruptions worsened. But businesses and consumers felt the pain now. Meanwhile, Canada stood firm, refusing to cave to U.S. demands. In fact, Ottawa issued a chilling warning. If the United States escalated further, Canada was prepared to retaliate with even tougher sanctions. The result? Washington was thrown into political turmoil. Some Republican lawmakers, especially those representing auto-heavy states, broke ranks with the administration, urging a trade resolution. Democratic leaders seized the moment, blaming the trade war for harming American workers and accusing officials of reckless economic policies. Consumer advocacy groups and business leaders launched campaigns against the tariffs, demanding an immediate reversal. With pressure mounting from all sides, it was clear that something had to give. But just when the crisis seemed to reach a boiling point, something unexpected happened. An outside force stepped into the fight, and no one saw it coming. A new player enters the fight: Mexico's unexpected move. While the U.S. and Canada were locked in an increasingly hostile trade war, Mexico saw an opportunity, one that would reshape the balance of power in North American manufacturing. For years, Mexico had been a key player in the auto industry, acting as a bridge between the U.S. and Canada. Factories in Mexico produced everything from auto parts to fully assembled vehicles, benefiting from lower labor costs and strong trade agreements. But as tensions between its two largest trade partners escalated, Mexico decided to shift its strategy. In a bold and unexpected move, Mexico announced new trade agreements, not with the U.S., but with Canada and Europe. The message was clear. Mexico was no longer waiting for the U.S. to resolve its trade war. It was moving forward without them. This decision sent shockwaves through the American auto industry. For decades, U.S. automakers had relied on Mexico for cheap labor and cost-efficient production. But now, Mexico was strengthening economic ties with Canada and European automakers, potentially cutting the U.S. out of its biggest manufacturing deals. European car brands like Volkswagen, BMW, and Renault saw a golden opportunity to expand in North America without relying on the U.S. market. Mexico's government, seeing the economic potential, offered new incentives and tax breaks to attract foreign automakers. Suddenly, American automakers weren't just losing ground to Canada, they were losing influence over Mexico as well. And that wasn't even the worst part. For decades, the U.S. had dominated North American trade. Now, for the first time, it was at risk of being sidelined entirely. With Mexico turning toward alternative trade partners, American auto companies found themselves in a terrifying position, one where Canada, Mexico, and Europe could thrive without them. And if something didn't change soon, the United States could permanently lose its grip on the global auto industry. China and Europe step in America's worst nightmare. While the United States struggled with trade wars and collapsing supply chains, other global players were watching and waiting for their moment to strike. That moment had arrived. China and Europe saw the chaos in North America as an opportunity. Chinese automakers and battery manufacturers ramped up production, aggressively marketing cheaper electric vehicles to fill the void left by American companies. China, which controls the world's supply of rare earth minerals used in EV batteries, tightened its grip, making it harder for U.S. automakers to compete in the electric vehicle race. European automakers expanded their presence in Mexico, taking advantage of the country's new trade agreements to flood North American markets with competitively priced vehicles. The result? American automakers were falling behind. U.S. car companies, already struggling with higher production costs, lost market share to cheaper Chinese and European competitors. Foreign automakers positioned themselves as more stable, cost-effective alternatives for international buyers. The once dominant U.S. auto industry was now fighting to stay relevant, and while Washington scrambled to contain the crisis, Canada was preparing to make its biggest move yet, one that could cripple the U.S. economy overnight. Canada's secret weapon: energy sanctions. While the United States and Canada were battling over auto tariffs, there was one industry that Washington never expected to be used as a weapon: energy. And yet, Canada had the perfect leverage. Few Americans realize that Canada is one of the largest suppliers of crude oil, natural gas, and electricity to the United States. Nearly 20% of all U.S. energy imports come from Canada. The Midwest and Northeast rely heavily on Canadian oil and electricity to keep the lights on. Factories, trucking companies, and even airlines depend on Canadian energy to stay operational. So when Canadian officials hinted at the possibility of restricting energy exports, Washington panicked. If Canada cut off energy supplies, the effects would be immediate and devastating. Gas prices would skyrocket, pushing already struggling Americans further into financial distress. Factories would face power shortages, forcing layoffs and further crippling manufacturing. Winter heating costs would surge, impacting millions of households in the Northeast and Midwest. The mere threat of energy sanctions sent shockwaves through the White House. For the first time since the trade war began, Washington was forced to reconsider its position. With global competitors gaining ground and energy shortages looming, the U.S. government faced an impossible choice: continue the fight and risk pushing the economy into a full-blown recession, back down and attempt to negotiate a new trade deal with Canada. But by now, the damage was done. America's reputation as the leader in North American trade was crumbling. Canada had proved it was willing to play hardball. Mexico had shifted its alliances. China and Europe were taking over the global auto industry. And Washington was left scrambling to clean up the mess. A turning point. Could the United States and Canada repair their relationship? With billions in losses mounting, pressure grew for the United States and Canada to end the trade war before it was too late. Business leaders, auto executives, and consumer advocates pushed for urgent negotiations. Automakers demanded a rollback of tariffs, warning that continued restrictions would lead to permanent damage. Politicians in swing states urged Washington to act, fearing a massive voter backlash if the crisis wasn't resolved. Economists warned that prolonged economic instability could cause a recession that would take years to recover from. In response, the U.S. government opened talks with Canada, hoping to salvage what was left of North America's once dominant trade network. Among the key proposals, reducing or eliminating tariffs on auto parts and raw materials, creating joint subsidies for electric vehicle production, allowing North America to compete with China, establishing new trade protections to prevent future economic retaliation. But even with negotiations underway, the question remained, would it be enough, or had the damage already been done? The future of the auto industry, a new world order? The U.S.-Canada trade war had already reshaped the auto industry forever. Canada emerged stronger, proving it was willing to stand up to Washington. Mexico secured new trade alliances, making it less dependent on the U.S. market. China and Europe expanded their influence, gaining the upper hand in global auto production. The era of American dominance in North American manufacturing was over. The question now, would the United States adapt, or be left behind? Because while Washington struggled to regain control, China was already leading the next phase of the auto revolution. And if the United States didn't act fast, it risked being permanently sidelined in the global economy. So what do you think? Is the U.S. auto industry doomed, or can Washington turn things around? Let us know in the comments below.